Hello, this is Pastor Don Long, and here we are in our Grafted In broadcast as we are in the middle of a series talking about one of our recent trips to Israel. Today on this broadcast, I have Unique Williams with me. Hi, Unique. How are you?
Awesome. How are you?
Unique gets excited whenever we talk about Israel. Well, so does Desi when she's here, and when we finally get Andrew in, maybe Andrew will be excited as well. Three young people who made the last trip with us to Israel. It was really a great time. And Unique, you and I were just talking before we began about some of the places we might want to talk about. Some that you said are a little more sad than others. And I want to talk about the ones that maybe aren't so sad. But let's take a little diversion for a moment. When we go to Israel, we talk about Alon Moreh, where Abraham came through. We talk about Shiloh, where the tabernacle was for 400 years. We talk about the biblical sites. We talk about the communities that are established in Judea and Samaria, which is the world calls the West Bank. But there are opportunities that we have to likewise become a little more modern and talk about modern Israeli history rather than ancient history. And so we get to visit some places that show us what it was like when God's people were first coming back in the 1930s, 1940s, coming back into the land of Israel, and what that was like for them. And we've talked on this broadcast before, and I know you're a student of Israeli history. You know all about the Balfour Declaration and about how Britain took part of that land and gave it away. Who'd they give it to?
Gave it to the Arabs.
They gave it to the Arabs, right. 3/4 of the land that belonged to the Jews. The British just unilaterally gave it away. Nobody gave them permission. The United Nations didn't say you can do it. They just gave it away to the Arabs. So if I were to ask you the question then, that the Palestinians today say that they want to have their own land, how would you answer that?
They have enough land. They need to go to their brothers.
So they already have in fact, they have their own state. What is it?
Lots of them. They have Jordan.
Jordan, right.
And Gaza.
And Gaza. But Jordan is 3/4 of the land that belong to the British Mandate. So if Palestinian Arabs say they want to have a homeland, they've got one. They can all go to Jordan. Of course, the problem with that is the people living in Jordan don't want them to come there for a lot of reasons we won't get into today. But when we read the history about that and how this was their land taken away, and yet the Balfour Declaration said that the Jews have a right to come to the land, and they have a right to inherit the land, and that Britain was charged to simply be the caretaker of the land until the Jews could have their own government. That's what they were. Turns out that the British decided they wanted to do other things. They wanted to keep the Arabs happy. The Arabs didn't want any Jews, so the British people started saying the Jews can't come here.
They issued the white paper.
And the white paper said
only so many Jews can come each year to Israel.
That's right, even though the Balfour Declaration said they can all come, right? So the white paper put a limit on it, but did that stop the Jews?
No, it did not. There were illegal immigrants who came to Israel. The Haganah and the Palmach snuck illegal immigrants over, and then the British had another challenge. They had to stop illegal immigrants from coming over.
You said the Palmach and the Haganah? What are those?
The underground, because the Israelis were not allowed to have their own army under the British rule.
So they had their underground armies. In fact, if there were original Palestinian patriots, they would be the Haganah and the Palmach. In fact, in those days, if you had a passport from that area of the world, it was called Palestine. So whether you were an Arab or whether you were a Jew, your citizenship was Palestine, right? So to say the Palestinians are the Arabs, no, the Jews who lived there were Palestinians in that term. So they started coming in anyway. Why? Because they had a right to. How did they come into how'd they get there?
They got there, the Haganah bought ships from trading companies, and these were old ships, by the way. They were leaking. They needed repairs. They tried the best they could, but sometimes they just didn't work. So they would overload them with people. These ships weren't made for people. They were made for cargo normally. Overload them with people on the ships.
Yeah.
Then they would ship them to Israel. And the hope was that they got there at night and they could sneak in on shore. But not always did that work.
So they're sending these ships in. A lot of these were refugees from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
A lot
Escaping
of
the Holocaust?
from the Holocaust, people who had, imagine, they had been kicked out of Poland. They'd seen all their families killed in the Holocaust. These are Holocaust survivors. They made their way maybe down to southern France. They get on a boat to go to the homeland, to go to Eretz Israel, only to find out that the British don't want them. And so when the British would capture these ships, they had two places that they would send them to. One was that if they got the ship at sea, they would send it to Cyprus. Mm-hmm. And in Cyprus, they had a big detention camp. But what did they do if they got onshore here and then they got captured?
They put them on another detention camp in Israel.
That's right. And it's called the Athlete Detention Center or camp. And this last tour, we got to go there. Mm-hmm. And of all the places we've seen in the Bible, this was the first time we got to see a detention center where the British put Jews who were simply trying to come to their homeland, and they had a legal right to do
Mm-hmm.
that. What was your impression of that place?
It kind of gave me a flashback of the Holocaust. They kind of had the same setup of the death camps. Not exactly the same, but kind of the same idea. Barbed wire fences, the showers. They didn't use gas, so they used actual water for the showers. Like things like that. So it kind of had a flashback on Europe. So you think these Jews are coming from Europe, and they get a flashback of what they already came from. Like, are they going to kill us, or what are they going to do to us?
I mean, think about that. You came out of Hitler's extermination camps where people were brought by train into a barbed wire enclosure, sent to showers and gassed, and you come to Israel and the British capture you and they put you in a barbed wire enclosure and say go to the showers. It's like, now they're real showers. They weren't killing them, but just the emotion of going through that. And then they had big bunk areas for them.
They had to stay in these bunk rooms. They had men and women. They didn't really keep the line, though. But that's where you would stay till you could get into the land, and it was a very hard process to get in out of that camp.
Right. So that was an awareness, I think, of the fact that even though the League of Nations had said you have a right to be there, the Balfour Declaration said you have a right to be there, even though the world had voted the Jews had a right to be there, Britain in its foreign office didn't want the Jews, mm-hmm. and so they treated them like they were illegal people coming in. They sought to displace them. There was a big movie made years ago about that whole experience called The Exodus.
Yes, I've seen that.
Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
Well, that's based on, it's a composite of the experience of young Jewish people and older ones, but primarily young ones, trying to come to Israel, which is their land, which God promised them. You know, this land is your land, you know. And the experience of having to fight through this British rule that didn't want to have them there. So that was part of our experience in seeing what was it like for those early pioneers. Now we can switch places then. We'll go to another one in terms of modern Israel, and that is Gush Etzion. And how many times have you been to Israel?
Once.
So this was your first trip to Israel. So Gush Etzion is kind of a shocking experience, I think. Would you say?
Yes. If you don't know about it.
If you don't know about it.
Like, I've read about it, so.
Even if you know about it, it's still sobering. Gush Etzion was simply a settlement of Jews that goes way back and has experienced the opposition of Arabs over the centuries. And many times Arabs have wiped out that community entirely. But in the War of Independence, do you know when that was?
1948.
Yep, 1948, the War of Independence. Gush Etzion was a settlement that stood in the way of the Egyptian army coming up to destroy the new state of Israel. And so Gush Etzion was a stronghold to protect Jerusalem. And the enemy forces were coming, and the settlers in Gush Etzion took all the women and the children and sent them to Jerusalem.
All the women who weren't fighters.
All the women who weren't fighters. Forgive me for forgetting there were women fighters there. Right, the women who were capable of fighting, who wouldn't have been mothers of children and so forth, single women, would stay behind as volunteers, as nurses perhaps, not just as fighters, though I think everybody knew how to handle a rifle. And so they left this contingent of people to block the Arabs from coming in and overrunning Jerusalem. And the settlement at Gush Etzion then was totally surrounded by the enemy, and the Israelis, the Haganah, tried to get supplies in. This was long before the day of helicopters when you could fly them in and everything, and they took these trucks and tried to build armor plate around them and tried to get them in. Some very heroic stories, but also some really sad stories of an entire convoy of people being killed on the way to Gush Etzion. And it finally came to the end of the siege that was there, and they were just vastly outnumbered. I can't recall if it's 100 to 1 or whatever, but you got these Arabs coming, and here are these people who are simply trying to defend their homeland, to defend their nation. And at the end, they're all killed. There was a bunker. Do you remember the story
Yes.
about the bunker?
There was a bunker, and one of the Arabs had one of the women fighters, and he gave her a grenade and asked her to throw it into the bunker. And she went because she knew that the wounded were there and they couldn't get out. And he ended up taking it and threw it in the bunker, so they all died.
So there was a bunker where all the wounded were being cared for down underground, and the Arabs simply threw hand grenades in there and killed them all. And as you see the movie of that, and there's a wonderful movie that talks about the history of that, then all of a sudden, remember the movie screen parts, and you go there and you're actually standing at the edge of that bunker where those people died. It's very sobering. It's very teary. It's emotional. But that was back, in the War of Independence. What's there now?
They rebuilt the communities there because the children of those who died in Gush Etzion were in Jerusalem. And there was this one oak tree. Now the Arabs, they will not destroy oak trees. It's against their religion. So they saw this one oak tree, and they would tell their children, look at that oak tree, that's where we came from, and we're going back. And I think it was about 1967, they got it back, and they went back and they rebuilt the communities that were there.
That was an amazing story, as the children of those who were killed and Gush Etzion could stand in Jerusalem, and you can see Gush Etzion from Jerusalem if you're on the hill, and they could see that oak tree. And every time they looked at that oak tree, that's our home, that's where we belong, and someday we're going to go back. What happened in 1967 that allowed them to go back?
Israel got land that they lost in the West Bank, and they got Jerusalem back.
That was the Great War of 1967, Quick War of 1967, surprised the whole world. Israel ended up getting the whole Sinai Peninsula, got the whole West Bank and Gaza, Golan Heights, yep.
Against all odds, they won.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the Arab armies who had surrounded Israel and threatened to destroy them and put them into the sea quickly said, we want peace, we want peace.
Yeah.
They didn't really want peace, they wanted to end the fighting.
That's because they were close to their capitals.
That's right. And so, as you said, then Israel got back that whole area, and Gush Etzion could be rebuilt. And so now there's a settlement there. Thriving community. I think there's primarily vineyards there. Lots of vineyards growing around. And like you say, schools and houses, and a lot of people who live in Gush Etzion actually work in Jerusalem, but this is where they live, this is where their families are. So let's think about that that war of 1967 unique. So at the end of that war, Israel had gained back land that was theirs. And tell me again, what were those areas that they
They
gained?
had the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights.
And so if we look at the West Bank, that's Judea and Samaria, we call it
And
the
Jerusalem.
Sharon, and Jerusalem. How much of Jerusalem did they have before that?
Half, I think.
Yeah, just about half of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem as a city was divided in half, and Israel had one half, and who was in charge of the other half?
The Jordanians.
The Jordanians.
And they would stand on the wall on their half and do snipers on where the Israelis were.
That's right. So when we say, well, let's divide a city, the Israelis
with
have some.
them.
They have some experience of a divided
Yeah.
city, don't they? When the city was divided, then the Jordanians on their side and the Arabs on that side would go up to the top of buildings and they'd shoot and kill civilians on this side. And so they had to build a wall between the city to separate them.
And still, sometimes a sniper could get in.
Yeah, and still a sniper could get through. We've had several of our guides in the past on trips that you weren't on who grew up in Jerusalem during those days and tell us about, we could come up to here, but we couldn't go. And one of the places they couldn't go was the Old City.
Mm-hmm.
What's
The Jews
so,
got kicked out.
yeah, what's so special about the Old City?
The Old City is the city of David. The Western Wall is there. So they couldn't pray at the Western Wall. They couldn't get close to Temple Mount. Actually, the Jews in 1948 were kicked out of the Old City.
So when you look at the modern history of Israel, and you look at Jerusalem, and people say, well, Jerusalem, it's an international city. It's important to the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, and it should be a city open to all. The only people that have ever helped Jerusalem be open to all are the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
When the Arabs controlled their half of Jerusalem, they destroyed synagogues
In churches.
and churches and would not allow the Jews to come and worship at their holiest place.
Or the Christians.
So stop and think about it. Why would we think if we divided Jerusalem now and gave half of Jerusalem to the Palestinian Arabs, why would we think that they're going to have freedom of worship?
Because we're ignorant.
That's right. They're really not going to do that, are they? So in 1967, all of the city of Jerusalem came under the control of Israel. So why didn't the Temple Mount come under the control of Israel?
They actually did have it, but they gave it to the Arabs for peace.
So there was a first example, maybe, of Israel saying, we're willing to give land if you'll give us peace.
Because it's the most holiest site in Judaism.
Right. And so they said, we'll allow the Islamic head, the Waqf, to be able to maintain control of Temple Mount. They had every right to simply say it's ours.
Yeah.
Always has been ours, it's ours now, and we'll let you visit, but it's ours.
Yeah.
Right now, if you go up on Temple Mount, can Jews go up there and pray?
No, you cannot pray. If a Christian goes up there, you cannot pray.
So you can visit at certain times, limited times. If you're a Jew, you're a Christian, you can go up and visit on top of Temple Mount, but you can't pray. So there's no freedom of religion. There's no respect of other religions within Islam.
Because if you go up there and pray, they'll kill you.
Yep. Or riots will start out or whatever else. So the Western Wall then, that was regained in the War of 1967. What did you think when you first came and saw the Western Wall?
It's hard to explain. You have to be there to experience. It's huge, and it's like touching a piece of history that Solomon could have touched and David.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
You walk in there, it is. It's this big wall. Is that the temple?
No, it's a retaining wall.
A retaining wall. So in other words, Temple Mount was built up around the mount called Moriah, and they built this big platform around it, and these were the big walls that held it so you'd have a platform up there. And the temple itself sat up on top, probably where the Dome of the Rock is right now, could be a little off to one side or the other. So this is simply the retaining wall. Why did the Jews treat it with such holiness?
Because it's the only part left we have in the temple.
It's the only part of that history that we can remember. So when you get there, I mean, it's this massive wall, but there's something about Temple Mount that is in the Western Wall that you can't describe. You have to experience it. It's the feeling that's there. And now there's two parts to the wall, Western Wall. There's a part where the men can go, and there's a part where the women can go. Did you go down there?
Yes.
And you go up to the wall, and what is unique in the wall? What do they?
We stick notes in the wall. Prayers.
Prayers in the wall. They put them in the wall, and that's something Jews do all the time. So literally thousands of prayers a year. Little piece of paper, you write a prayer to God, and you stick it in the little cracks in the wall. And in fact, recently we heard an amazing story. I don't want to retell the whole story, but of a young man who he and his parents were separated. His father and he disagreed. They were Jewish, and the young man didn't really want to have anything to do with his Jewish heritage. And so there was a split in the family, and they didn't talk and didn't communicate. And the young man had some experiences later where he reconnected with his Jewish roots, where he embraced it again. And in the story, his true story, his father passes away. And he goes to the Western Wall, and he's deeply touched by his Jewish faith, his Jewish roots there, and he decides to write a prayer asking God to help heal the relationship between him and his father, even though his father's dead now. And he wraps it up. You remember the story? I think I told this in church. And he goes to put the paper in the wall, and as he does, another paper that's there falls out. And when he bends over to pick it up, he looks and immediately recognizes the handwriting. It's his father's. And his father had made a trip to the Western Wall several months before he passed away, and he wrote a note asking God to help heal the son, the relationship with he and his son. So it actually happened at that wall. And that's pretty powerful. I think we went to the wall several times while we were there. We got there one night. Did we go visit it in the evening?
Yes, we visited on Friday night.
Friday night, which was Shabbat. All the people. Remember all the people coming?
Lots of people.
Lots of people. And we would see. I think we would see rabbis with their entourage of girls coming along. So they obviously had it like a girls' school or something. And everybody dressed up because it's Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like having Shabbat in Jerusalem?
Amazing. It's like one of those things you have to be there to experience.
It was quite a thing. How do you know? It's like, would you like to do that again?
Yes, definitely.
Would you like to do that every Shabbat?
Yes, definitely.
Jerusalem is a city that is rich in history, and when we go to Jerusalem, and if you come on a trip with us to Jerusalem, we'd love to have you come on one of our trips. We don't go to the traditional, many of the traditional Christian sites, because what we're trying to get is the biblical history. We go to all the fortifications that were there when David was king, but we also get to see a lot of places where we know Yeshua was.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the places, again, a lot of tourists don't get to, but is what we believe is the Pool of Bethesda. And remember how Moshe took us down there, and we can see where the water, they haven't been able to excavate back because
the orchard that's there, they won't let them excavate under it.
Right, there's an orchard there that right now one of the churches owns and controls and won't let them dig under it. But that's the Pool of Bethesda. You can open your Bible and look in the Gospels, and you read about Yeshua being at the Pool of Bethesda, and you think you're standing right on the rocks that Yeshua probably stood on. And then there was a walkway that started going up, and we started going up that. Remember, Moshe took us up there. So much history. down by Temple, the wall, the Western Wall, and we're looking down at pavement stones that go back to the Second Temple period, we know that Yeshua walked on those stones.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. It's not like that's a good tourist thing to say. No, we know that those are the original stones of the street that came from that period. Does it make the Bible a little more exciting?
Yes, it does.
It's like you open your Bible now. Do you ever read your Bible and you have pictures of what you're seeing over there? It's kind of fun, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like, whoa, there's so much that you can see there. So Jerusalem is so rich in biblical history and what goes on there. There's many more things to see in Jerusalem. We don't do it all. Maybe once every 10 years or 8 years, we might go to the Holocaust Museum. That's a long experience in and of itself. And then we get a chance to see a little bit of modern Jerusalem. Tell me about Ben Yehuda Street.
It's a busy place. It's like a market, outside markets. You have your fruits and vegetables, your meats out in the open, and it's very busy on Friday nights.
It is. It is. When we go to the market, everybody's yelling and screaming and.
Because they want you to buy their wares. They'll tell you apples for $2, this for $5. They're yelling at top of their lungs.
Except, of course, they're saying it in Hebrew, so we don't have a clue. You know. How do you buy things over there?
With shekels.
Yeah, shekels.
With their currency.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Because you do American dollars, it's more. So
right. So
you
change your dollars into shekels and they're all, you don't know how to count the shekels, just stick it
and
out.
They're honest.
They're honest. Yeah, they'll take what is theirs and everything. And then on Ben Yehuda Street, you have all the gift stores and lots of people walking around. It's kind of a fun place. Mm-hmm. And we tend to spend 3 nights in Jerusalem. It's a great place. Do you like the hotels over there?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you like the food over there?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have enough?
Mm-hmm.
They have plenty. What's so different about Israeli breakfast?
Israeli breakfast, they serve salad.
Salad, lots of it for breakfast.
Yeah. At first I'm like, what? Salad for breakfast? Who's heard of that? It's actually really good.
Yeah. Everything is smorgasbord. You just go up and help yourself, but lots of salads all the time. Lots of fish. And but did you enjoy the food?
Mm-hmm. Lots of dairy.
I did too. Well, that's give you a taste of Israel a little bit. But we sure would like to see you join us on one of our trips. And next week we will continue our journey through Israel. This is Pastor Don Long. Sure glad you joined us today.